From the Zimmerman Symphony Center in Canton, Ohio, this is Orchestrating Change. I'm Matthew Jenkins Yarashevitz, Associate Conductor of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Rachel Hagemeyer, Manager of Education and Community Engagement.
Welcome to Season 3 of our podcast. We are so glad you could join us.
This podcast navigates issues that exist in the field of classical music and the world at large. We invite you to listen with open ears as our guests share their experiences and as we discuss these often avoided topics.
Our guest today is composer Angélica Negrón. Her works range from traditional orchestral and chamber pieces to compositions for accordion, toys, and electronics, and have been performed by such prestigious ensembles as the Dallas Symphony, the National Symphony, and the Kronos Quartet, among many others. She was an artist in residence at National Sawdust in Brooklyn and is currently a teaching artist for the New York Philharmonic's Very Young Composers program. Originally from Puerto Rico, she grew up playing piano and violin before coming to New York City for studies at New York University and the CUNY Graduate Center. Angélica Negrón, welcome to Orchestrating Change.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here with us today. Can you just share a little bit about how you grew up and how music was a part of your life when you were a child?
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and very musical family, but mostly just that's very common there. So just music in every party and big family. I'm an only child, but my mom has 8 brothers and sisters, so lots of cousins. I have one aunt that she used to be an opera singer and conduct the San Juan Children's Choir. So she was like the classical musician in my family, and she had a big impact on my upbringing. But I would say I played piano. Mostly it was just Disney musicals. So I still can play Under the Sea pretty well. Part of Your World, that was my repertoire. But then there was another side of me. I was really extroverted as a kid. That changed a lot after high school. But I would put on shows like in lunchtime, and I would impersonate, like there was this really famous Brazilian children's TV star, Xuxa, and I would put on a show during lunchtime and wear boots like her, and which was kind of weird and inappropriate because she had a kids show, but her show really was the joke always with Xuxa was that she dressed for the parents and she sang for the kids. So there I would be in first grade impersonating this this singer. So and I love to dance and put on shows for my family. I had this club called Club de Niños con Arte, which is an awful name, but and that translates even worse, but club of children with art or something like that. That was me and my cousins.
Oh man.
And we would put on shows and for my family. So yeah, and then the classical music was just kind of I did not see it as it was, the musical formation, but it was not the music that I was super excited about. It was the thing that I was doing after school.
Yeah.
It took me a little while to get to a place in which those two things kind of then found some meaning together.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you loved music, didn't necessarily love playing instruments, and ultimately you ended up as a composer. How did you discover composition, and what led you to decide to pursue it as your career?
Well, when I was in high school, I discovered Tori Amos, Bjork, Fiona Apple, a lot of women singer-songwriters, and that kind of blew my mind and my world. And so I was starting to get really excited about um, about music and lyrics and arrangements and producing, but I was not doing any of that. I was still studying violin, and just I kept studying music because even though violin did not feel like my instrument, or it just, I loved music, and I was like, okay, I guess I'm gonna continue practicing, and maybe when I get better, I'll love it. But that did not happen. So it really was through pop music, like mostly experimental pop, and also through then after connecting with those artists, just resonating with me and listening to them a lot and being obsessed with them, starting my own band, and then starting to make music with other people. And so that was my first attempt at composing, was just making music with others. And because my first band was a little bit atypical, it was a string quintet with a singer and electronics, that I was notating things down. So I guess that actually turned out to be my portfolio for auditioning to the composition department, because I had no idea that composing was even a possibility. I'd been playing music most of my life, but I never played something by someone that was living. So I didn't know it was a possibility. I got really curious about like learning how to play the cello, the harp, started teaching myself the accordion, and I just thought I was the most unfocused violin student ever. But it turned out I was just curious about sounds around me, and I wanted to write for all of them. So it was kind of like a long route through bands, through starting to learn other instruments, and then discovering there was an actual composition department that was like 3 people there. All like 3 guys, and then I joined that department, and again used my compositions for that band that was mostly pop, like experimental pop music, but that was written down because of the instrumentation, and then with that just switched to composition and have never looked back.
Wow. It's so interesting. Fiona Apple is a really interesting singer-songwriter. I really like her stuff. And she uses a lot of orchestral sounds in her works a lot, which is really fun. There's a song by her, Extraordinary Machine, that has like so many wind parts, and there's like fun little bassoon riffs, and I play the bassoon, so I love that song so much.
Awesome.
So that's really interesting, bringing, these pop vocalists and like listening to them and inspiring you to go into composition. But you mentioned you studied it, and we kind of mentioned this in your intro. You went to the Conservatory of Music of Puerto Rico, New York University, the CUNY Graduate Center, all these awesome places. And as you mentioned, you didn't realize that composition, getting a degree in composition, was a possibility. I think a lot of people don't. We don't really think of composers as living people. A lot of people assume that they're old and dead.
Although for any of you who have been listening to the podcast
that's
from
not
the very
true.
beginning, all of you, of course, know that's not true at this point.
Yeah, we've talked
We're
with
out
many.
here.
Yeah, we've talked with many composers now. But when you decided to go to school, kind of what surprised you about like the actual process of getting a degree in composition, and what actually goes into studying composition to become professional in it?
Yeah, well, it was an interesting time and realization, that because there was this part of me that I was like, this is what I'm meant to do. I found my thing, composing, great. And then when I started studying it, because my first attempts at composing, or my first like adventures in composing, were not caring about technique or any of that. It was just like very intuitive. Then I was like, wait, there's a right and wrong way of doing this, which, it's also, I don't think it's true, but it did feel very much that way when I was starting to study composition. And then all this identity things came up too, of like, who are you and your music, and your music doesn't sound Puerto Rican, and what does it mean? And just like a bunch of other things that I was like, wait, okay, then I'm not ready to deal with this existential kind of part of it. But I would say that, as I continue to study, like even till later in life and my doctorate, which it is I think a huge commitment that especially graduate studies and doctorate, that requires a lot of stamina, also a lot of writing words, that, and partly that's also why I had to pause on my doctorate, was because I was not writing as much music and I was writing more words, and I had to make a choice. And I think also, especially moving to the US as a Latina woman, like it's also, to be completely frank, it's also a lot of navigating spaces and structures that, that were not meant to include me. So that also adds another layer to that of complexity. But yeah, it's also at the same time an opportunity to connect and study with people I admire. I really started a doctorate. The main reason was because I wanted to study with Tania Leon, and she's a dear friend and a mentor, and that has been, instrumental in my life. And same in Puerto Rico too. I studied with Alfonso Fuentes, a brilliant Puerto Rican composer. That I always joke is the male Tania Leon, the male Puerto Rican Tania Leon. Have a lot of similarities and have never met. But then my music is completely different from the two of them too. So there's, I think, at least from my perspective, there was a lot of challenges that came with studying composition formally. A lot of things that I'm still trying to kind of turn off that part of my brain when I'm composing, because it gets to be distracting and gets in the way of my creative process. But at the same time, it was also really, it was a way for me to get nerdy about, things that I'm really curious and passionate about with people that I really admire. So that's also, that's also something very special.
Amazing. So, okay, so far you said you first were inspired to start composing because of your interest in pop music. Yeah. And then subsequently you said, but my music doesn't sound Puerto Rican. So tell us a little bit then about what is your music like? Yeah. If you had to describe a few representative compositions, what is your music like? And what inspires you?
Yeah, well, this is always really tough. And I mean, I'll say also that with the my music doesn't sound Puerto Rican is something I get a lot from Puerto Ricans and also from people here. And so it's I do feel like my music sounds very Puerto Rican, because how can it not? Because I am from the island. Right. So I do feel strongly that my music does sound Puerto Rican, but just I think when I mentioned it was more in the context of like, there's this kind of like weird cultural depth that sometimes it's put on people to kind of represent what the sound of a place and quote unquote is, which we could do a whole nother hour about that, but for sure. I digress. But to your question about like what is, like, how do I describe my music, I think there are some words that keep coming up in my process and in just how I approach sound. I think open, vulnerable, open in vulnerability, but also open in the sense of trying to rethink what a performance space is, what an instrument is, just kind of opening up possibilities. Playful, I'm really drawn to not only toy instruments and non-conventional music makers, but just I'm drawn to a sort of irreverence that takes it, that of music that doesn't take itself too seriously, which is also why I love people and composers like Meredith Monk, for example. Yeah. And then there's also something curious and quotidian and domestic about it too. I love to put in conversation instruments that are part of the traditional instrumentation with objects and instruments that are not thought of as being in, or are not often incorporated in or seen together, and not really having that as like, oh, this is this quirky thing, or this kind of, what's the word, that there's like a gimmick, or that there's this kind of novel thing of like, oh, maybe that's the entry point for someone. But what I'm really interested is in putting them both in the same kind of level, and not feeling like one is elevating the other or diminishing the other. It's just like they both make cool sounds. What happens when you have them engage with each other?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember I've gotten to see you present, and I've heard, parts of your music, and I've looked some stuff up. Would you mind giving a couple of examples to us? Just like kind of explain. I know you wrote something for the Dallas Symphony. It's a full orchestra, but then there's also some fun stuff hiding in the middle in the percussion section. So
yeah, well, the percussion section, especially for orchestra, percussion and keyboard is where I can have a lot of my fun percussion with fun objects, but also in the MIDI, in the keyboard, incorporating MIDI instruments too, and some of my own samples from objects from my kitchen. Like a lot of pots and pans, and I love sounds that are in between pitches, that they're not like, they sound like it could be a bell or an instrument that someone would play in the orchestra, but then there is something about the timbre of it and the pitch that is a little off. And also playing with, taking out really important parts of the sound, like the attack, for example. If you hit a pot or a pan in your kitchen, and then the attack is the thing that tells you, oh, you just hit this thing in your kitchen. But then if you take that out and just leave the resonance and use that as a pad, then how can that also, be in conversation with a brass moment in the orchestra, and things like that are really exciting to me. So the more I find myself writing, because I think I did a lot of that for chamber music and solo pieces, but the more I find myself now writing for orchestra, it's also kind of it's a tricky territory to navigate, because of, limited time and resources, and limited just capabilities of making those things that require a little more extra time work. But I'm really thankful to be working with people like the Dallas Symphony that are up for those things.
Yeah. Really fun. It's really fun stuff. It's so cool.
So you described this, the samples of your own kitchen pots and pans, and they would be, you pre-record them, I guess, and the musicians manipulate that in the performance, with the recorded sound. But what are some things that the Dallas Symphony percussion section might have to scrounge around their attic to bring in to actually play in the concert hall, and hopefully hold up so that all the audience can see this novelty of the concert hall?
How fun.
Well, actually, I'm thinking now of, in that piece for the Dallas Symphony, I think I sampled a lot of things for my kitchen, but then in the percussion, it was pretty standard, the instruments that I had. It's weird. I get pretty specific about the kind of pot I want. So then I'm like, either I ship that to the orchestra, or I sample it and have the keyboard player play it in a MIDI keyboard.
That's so fun.
So I get I'm pretty attached to my wok and the caldera I have. So I think I went more on the safer side on the actual instruments that the orchestra is playing. It's like vibraphone and a lot of pitch percussion but that said, I'm also interested in, like, that piece that I wrote for the Dallas Symphony is really inspired by bell-like tones, and it uses a lot of glockenspiel, vibraphone, crotalis, and I'm really interested in those. These are like professional percussion instruments, right? But their resonance, like, the more you leave it lingering, and then how can that connect with like string harmonics or things like that, and then how that is a connection that for me it's super obvious to the resonance of my wok, and having those two things happening simultaneously, and how they can complement each other and like kind of bring out new colors. But yeah, I just finished a piece for the Seattle Symphony in which the vibraphone is prepared with aluminum foil. So I guess that's and that's inspired by my friends from So Percussion that have done that before. But yeah, I now that I'm thinking about it, I'm pretty conservative. Maybe I should bring the pots and pans to the actual orchestra.
That's
next
amazing.
Piece.
Yeah, how fun. Yeah.
Will this be your first performance for the Seattle Symphony? Your first piece that they will have performed? Congratulations.
Be, yeah.
Wow.
That's so fun.
Thank you. That's coming up in April, and I just finished the piece. I'm really excited. Yeah, this year it's been a lot of orchestral music.
That's cool.
I'm on my fourth, just on my fourth orchestral piece in the past 5 months.
Wow.
So it's never in my life, I thought. And I'm also, it's combined with deep existential crisis of what else do I have to say with this medium and what am I doing here and all the things.
Yeah.
But, keep going and trying to find new ways of sharing stories.
Wow, that's really cool. And what's interesting is, so a lot of traditional orchestral patrons, what we see at an orchestra hall tend to be a little afraid of new music. I think, this idea of like atonality and crazy things happening on stage and the non-traditional aspect of music really scares some orchestra patrons, and they're less likely to want to listen to it, or they don't know what's happening. So they're afraid of it. But I wonder what you would say to people who are maybe afraid of the new music. What would you recommend to them to listen to, or how do you think about new music in a way that you think might open some people up to this idea of seeing things in a new light, listening in new ways, adding in these new sounds? Because it's not scary. It can be really fun. There's pots and pans involved.
Yeah. That this is such a good question. I have many thoughts around that, but I do feel like because there's so little representation of living composers in general in the orchestral and also opera world, like those larger institutions, we get to hear very little. And then it is as if you reverse that, and you would hear just a little bit of classical music, it might not be the classical music that you're into. It's just like if you're hearing just a little bit of something, then you're missing so much. And then people make really bold decisions on like, this is not for me, based on that tiny representation of what they're getting from new music. But there's so much more out there. Then there's obvious things too that are, tied to, it's hard for me not to go into just thinking about also how these things are attached to barriers that are connected to systemic racism and classism too. And people that have been very purposefully excluded from these spaces too. And then the little we hear, then it's, then it could be that piece was for you, but it could also be that it's not for you. And then you make a choice that that's not your thing. So I think the obvious thing for me is to have more of that and more diverse, not only in ethnicity and age and all of that and gender, but also diversity in styles, because there's so much different new music out there. Yeah. And I think for me, if programmers and organizations are really thinking about like the main thing, which is, the storytelling and the program and what is it that makes a great program, then even if you don't like the piece, then there's something there about the storytelling that could get to you. I think it transcends the music. There's something about, like, if we're not trying to check boxes, if we're just like really programming thoughtfully, I think audiences will respond to that. And then there are, many other things that could be done in terms of community engagement, education, making sure that, that the programming also reflects the community that they're in, that, there are partnerships that highlight the work that the people are doing there already, not being like, here is culture for you, and just being really like, what is the culture that is there already, and celebrating that. And yeah, there's sorry, I went on a rant. There's so much to say about that, yeah. But I think it really starts with that there is not enough representation of, I'm not even talking about women composers or composers, that have been underrepresented. I'm just talking about living composers.
Yeah.
So even just getting there to a place in which there is more out there, I think, the more we hear, the more people will have a chance to connect to something.
That's a really good point.
So I have a question to follow up on all this. um, the audience, we're talking here about how we can hopefully open audience members' minds up about new music. But from a composer's perspective, do you even consider the audience when you're writing, or should you even consider the audience, or is it most important to write what you feel as an artist, what you feel moved to write?
Yeah, that's another really good question that I'm not sure I have a straightforward answer to. I can tell you that I'm not thinking of the audience in terms of like, oh, I want this to be accessible, and like I'm gonna make sure that I want to write a melody here because then if it's atonal, then it won't be light. I'm never thinking in those terms. Each piece is its own world and kind of reveals itself as I'm writing and tells me what it wants to be. So I'm not, that part of my brain is not engaged in the creative process, but I do feel like, and it all goes to back to the concept of the piece and the stories I'm trying to tell. They come from a very human place that, because they're from my lived experience, I am sure will connect with someone else. So in that sense, I'm always thinking about the audience too. And I'm also very consciously, particularly when I'm when it's pieces that have electronics and things like that, I'm very consciously thinking of ways that I can invite people in. And so I think accessibility in the sense of inviting rather than something that is, I don't know if this is the right word in English, but palatable or, just, it's more of like, how can I invite others to this? And that might reflect in choices of like, instead of me playing a keyboard, I'm playing a plant for this piece, or it might show up in that the piece, instead of being in a concert hall, lives in a forest, and then you're invited to join in at some point by shuffling leaves, or it kind of manifests in different ways. But in that sense, I am always considering the audience, but it is more of a, when it feels like a genuine part of what the piece needs to be, not this kind of external thing of what will people think. Because I did some of that earlier in my life and it was not fun. And I don't want to do that anymore.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And like to write something, if you write something authentically, and I think we've talked about this in like a lot of different angles on the podcast, of when you're genuine and authentic, more people are going to want to be a part of it, because people can sense when something is genuine. People can sense when something is authentic. And I think that goes for music as well. If you write from you as a composer, this is what this is, come along with us.
I truly 150% agree with that. And it took me a long time to realize that. I had this, because of what we talked about before, right? My first impulse to write music was because of my connection to pop music. And then when I started to study music composition formally, I kind of was like, I have to silence that part of myself, and then I need to sound like a certain way so for people to take me seriously, which is also has to do a lot with gender and with identity too. It's just like, no, I'm not supposed to be here, but let me tell you, I'm supposed to be here. But then in order for you to take me seriously, I have to sound like you. And then that's really problematic. So many years of internalized, just trying to sound like someone I was not, and then suppressing parts of myself that were really important to me and that were the things that brought me to music in the beginning. So I think interestingly enough, it took me that year that I took off from my master's to my doctorate. The first time I was not writing music for anyone else, and I was not showing music to any professors. It's just writing music for myself. And that really made a big shift, and that was like 2009. And it was all about what you were just saying, being authentic and genuine to who I was, and not really caring about all these kind of imaginary boundaries that felt very real at the time. And then I really trust that when you're bringing your most authentic self to what you do, then people will respond to that, and that really connects with people.
Wow. Yeah. And, speaking of people and like the audience, we ask all of our podcast guests to give a recommendation to our audience, to our listeners, about something that has maybe been inspiring to you, or just something fun you've been doing, maybe a book that you really liked, or a piece of music you really liked. Doesn't have to be music related at all, but just something that you think our audience would like or might open them up to something new.
Well, there's many things that I've enjoyed recently. I would say one thing that I've been obsessed with for the past month is Arca, who's an electronic musician that also produced for Kanye West, Bjork, FK Twigs. But she's an incredible Venezuelan trance music maker that I've been following for many years, and just released in December 4 albums back to back in the span of a week. And it's pretty out there things, like very experimental, also some reggaeton inspired things in there. But the very last one of those, they're all called Kick. So Kick 5, the very last one, is the most kind of intimate, introverted, quiet, almost ambient, with a lot of processed piano and interesting vocals too. And it's just, and I'm obsessed with it. It's just, Arca is just such a fantastic and brilliant artist. But this album has, like, I don't know how she does it, but it's like super poppy, but at the same time very experimental, introverted, but also larger than life. Like really dark, but also super luminous. I don't know, like very shy, and at the same time very mysterious and sexy. I don't know. It's all the things at once in a way that makes me feel like I would never be able to do that. And I love listening to music that just even makes me forget that I write music. Just I'm fully in it.
Yeah, that's insane. 4 back to back.
Yes.
Wow.
So one that was I think in 2020. What year are we? 22.
I know, right?
So 2020 was one, Kick 1, I think, and then 4 like at the end of this past year.
Wow.
And Kick 5 is, I mean, they're all really good, but Kick 5 is the one that I'm currently really listening to.
Wow. That sounds really cool.
Amazing. So before we go on, those of you listening to the podcast audio only will not know that Angélica has a vibrant, bright pink hair color right now. Tell us a little bit.
And an awesome sweater.
Yeah, a sweater to match.
You. Oh yeah.
And so tell us, what inspired you to go pink, and how long?
I think it's fading a little bit. It used to be more purple.
Yeah, when I saw you, it was purple.
So it goes between pink and purple. It's been a while, like I think almost 4 years of this color, or shades between purple and pink. I love color. I love playing with color in my music and in my instruments, and it's also a big part of who I am. So it's just. Yeah, I love playing with it. And at the same time, I think the same way I was talking about suppressing parts of myself in my music, I think a lot of the times I was like, I'm you can't tell because we're on Zoom and I'm sitting down, but I'm 4'11", I'm tiny. And it's, a lot of the times, especially when I'm in spaces like orchestral spaces, or that I want people to take me seriously, I was like, no, I have to dress a certain way. I can be, I'm already tiny and I'm a woman. So, and then I use toy instruments, and people are like always thinking everything is cute but it took me a while to be like, you know what? I can't care about those things anymore. I have to be unapologetically me and let the music speak for itself. And if someone wants to keep it at a surface level and just in a review or in talking about music say it's cutesy or whatever, then that's not on me, that's on them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's,
Wow.
when I saw you in person, your hair was a little more purple and you still did the thing where you matched your clothes to your hair, like almost perfectly. I don't know how you do it, but it's really impressive because you're doing it again.
Happens.
You're doing it again today. Your sweater like matches your hair perfectly. It's awesome. That makes a lot of sense of like the way that you appear, and people make snap judgments about that. And especially as someone who creates art, I can see why people would then put that snap judgment of what you look like onto the art that you make. Mm-hmm. I like not kind of wanting to hide that so people like look normal so that they just judge your art and don't try to put what I am onto it. But I think, I think it's something that a lot of young people nowadays are coming to earlier. I think I see a lot of young people like with their own like sense of style already, and I didn't have my own sense of style. I'm still figuring out my sense of style.
I still don't think I have a sense of a unique sense of style. I mean, I kind of just dress the way I always have for my entire life.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. Yeah,
I think also, I mean, a big part of my musical formation is playing in bands too, and I still play in a band, and so always have been really aware of also that the visual aspect is really important, not only in in how you look but also the instruments you play, your stage presence, all of those things are super important too, and I think that because a lot of my life has been like coexisting in those two worlds that I put very separate, like the playing in DIY spaces and in bands, and then also the classical music world, which are two very different ones, and a lot of me kind of blossoming into my own self, and also just being tired because I'm 40 now. It has been like just it is all part of who I am, and there's no need to put things in separate boxes, and also in a way embracing those things and being even more intentional about them, so that that, because that's also I think a really important part of the conversation. I remember like many years ago reading this article on New Music Box by Sarah Kirkland Snyder, the composer, that was like called, I think, Candy Floss and Merry-Go-Rounds. That used like this quote that was said about her in a review, and it's the same thing that we're just talking about in terms of appearance, but like she writes gorgeous melodies in her music, and then people tying that to her identity as a woman, and then as something that is like kind of diminishing her work, because it's like, oh yeah, women are emotional, all of these things that we know all too well, but for me it's another way of reclaiming those things, embracing them, and being unapologetic and being like, yes, all of those things. It doesn't mean that because I have pink or purple hair that I can be taken seriously when I walk into an orchestra hall, or it also is part of who I am and part of my music, and
so you're really involved in the composition community, and like we've mentioned, you have stuff playing all over the country, and you do 5 orchestra compositions, but you also contribute a lot in the education space as well. You're right now a teaching artist for the New York Philharmonic's Very Young Composers Program, and you also co-founded, I'm gonna say it wrong.
Okay. It's a hard word, don't worry.
How do you say it?
Acopladitos.
Yes. I don't have a good Spanish accent, which it's a Spanish immersion music program designed to cultivate young children's first musical encounters through like singing and movement and working with parents and all these different experiences. Why are you a part of these teaching experiences, and what do you think is so valuable about especially these very young educational moments in music?
Well, I think a big part of it is that I never even knew that composing was a possibility when I was that young. And the founder of the Very Young Composers program, John Deek, he talks a lot about how in visual arts, when we're in preschool, we get to play with clay and different materials and paint and explore what it feels to mix colors together and to do different shapes. And that's very common, and everyone has that experience, right, growing up in school and in their home. But with music, it is pretty different. There's a lot of the times the first entry point to music is through technique. There's a right or wrong way of playing something. So there's kind of like this this gap in arts education is tied to music, and that we don't get to play with sound. And you could be like playing an instrument and a master at your instrument for many years, but you never got to play with sound, which I found kind of sad. And so I'm really passionate about kind of making space for those opportunities for younger people, and also demystifying what a composer is, because that's also something that's really important to me, for people to realize that once you're making choices about sounds and organizing them, and if you're excited about it and you're and there's an intent behind it, then you're a composer. And that composer with a capital C is not saved for just a few privileged ones that have been able to study. Or so I think I think it's I'm like super excited about what young people have to say in music, and it just keeps me grounded and reminds me of why I'm doing this in the first place. Which, as grateful and obvious, like not obviously, but as grateful and as honestly very surprised I am that I get to do this for a living. It is also my job, and if I'm not writing music, I'm not paying my rent and my student loans. So it could, with so many deadlines back to back, could also lose some of the magic that started for me in the beginning. So working with young people and in this initiatives also reminds me that it is a pretty cool thing that I get to do every day, and it's like sounds are a pretty special thing, and the way that we can share stories without words, sometimes it's pretty magical. So yeah, that's why I keep doing it.
Yeah,
that is amazing.
That's a lot. Yeah,
that is so amazing.
Young people are great, and they have a lot to say.
Yeah, and
Yes.
Rachel and I have experienced some of that working with our youth orchestra here at the Canton Symphony.
Yeah.
It's really it's remarkable what young people can do.
Yeah.
When you
Yep.
give them the opportunity.
Yeah.
It's really remarkable what they're
Yep.
able to achieve.
Yeah.
And to have the chance to do it at an early stage, and also in places that have, because you're in the community, so it obviously reflects the makeup of the community, then you're hearing from all these people that we haven't heard in these classical music spaces, which makes it for me even more exciting, because I'm like, yes, that's why we need you in the concert halls and beyond. It's because we haven't heard these stories, and when they don't have all these years of all this training too, it in a way also it makes it more exciting, because then imagination comes into play more, and there's no preconceived notions of what is music or what is a musical sound, and then everything is a possibility. And that's for me what is the thing that's going to save this moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. Ugh.
It's so interesting. I never really tried composing growing up. I played instruments and sang and everything, but I never tried composing. And then in college, I did a little bit, and I found by that point I was so steeped in the rules of Western art music that I could actually imitate 18th and 19th century composers pretty well. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't bring myself to break a bunch of rules. Like, it was just so... Yeah. It was so ingrained. And for kids to have the opportunity without ever having learned the rules to simply create. I mean, I think it's such a crucial part of the development of the brain of a young child. And it's something, honestly, I think I missed out on.
Yeah. And it begs the question of how do we teach and how do we approach music in a way that encourages sound exploration, encourages own individual thinking, with also introducing like these ideas of like rules and structures, like they do exist, they do help us write, but how do we balance, it's like this idea of like, how do we balance all of that? And what does this actually mean? And cause it's, when I was a kid, I remember like I grew up in like a bluegrass household. My dad plays in a bluegrass band. So I first got introduced to the bassoon at a campfire at a random music festival in Kansas. So like my conceived notion of what classical music was very different. So I have like this, like the jam mentality of what I call it, when people just hang out and jam and play music together, which a lot of classical musicians are abhorrent to. They're like, I don't know what this means. I don't understand. So I'm really grateful I grew up with that. But then at the same time, I still, because I do have a classical music training, it takes me a little bit to fall back into that sometimes to remember how it works. But yeah.
It obviously, as with every thing that you put your mind to, but I would say in classical music, there's a discipline, and you have to give so much to it that it is really easy to lose yourself. And it's important to reconnect with why you're making music in the first place. It's sort of, it is pretty sad that sometimes in school, we lose that. But, sometimes also there are great mentors that you find along the way that remind you of that. Or there are other opportunities in your professional career that then put you in places in which I never thought that I thought I really hated teaching. I used to teach violin, and I was like, oh, this is not for me. And, it obviously then became very clear that because violin was not my thing, that I did not like, obviously, teaching violin. But when I started doing teaching artist work and doing creative composition projects with kids, I was like, this is amazing. I'm in love with this. And I stumbled upon that because I was looking for a job. The same way I stumbled upon starting a music education for babies in Spanish. That was because I was looking for a job, and I just finished my master's full of students' loans from NYU. And then I ended up being an assistant for a Mommy and Me music class, and basically just cleaning maracas after class, and vacuuming the rug after the kids were playing. And I was like, oh, these songs are awful. We need more repertoire in Spanish. And then my best friend had just moved to New York, and we started writing music for kids in Spanish. So I think, sometimes these things happen, in those unexpected ways, but it's also in a way awakens something in you that has been burning for a while.
Yeah. Wow.
That's amazing. So as I mentioned at the top of the show, you were an artist in residence at National Sawdust, which is a prestigious new music venue in Brooklyn, New York. And for it, you are writing a drag lip sync opera called Chimera, which explores the ideas of fantasy and illusion and the intricacies and complexities of identity. This, to me, is an absolutely fascinating project. Tell us more about this.
So Chimera was born out of my love and respect for the drag community. I am not only a big fan of the art of drag, but I also was really fortunate when I was growing up. When I was talking about my extroverted childhood, I did not mention that I also grew up around a lot of drag queens, and that were my mom's friends. So I would just be in their shows and do opening numbers, and help them pad their outfits and things like that. So that was a very formative part of my life, and something that I now looking back, as I'm many years after, pretty particular way to grow up in a small island in the Caribbean. So, so out of that, and also my impulse in always shaking up things, I was like, what if I take the main element in an opera, and what if I take that out and the voice is not present, but it's recorded? And how can that also play into narrative? And I started playing with that a little bit in a residency I did at National Sawdust. That's not only an amazing venue, but also a really, really awesome artistic hub and community for artists that Paola Prestini, the founder and composer, has created. And started playing a little bit with that there. I wrote about half an hour of the opera. It's still ongoing. I have been doing other projects that are satellite projects that connect to it and that are informing what the larger thing will be. Now, I'm not even sure it's going to be staged. I'm thinking it might be a film. So yeah, it is because it's such a personal and close to my heart project. And it's the one thing that I've been working on that is not a commission. It's just my passion project. The thing that's not so great about that is that I get to work on it only when I have time. But at the same time, the good thing is that I can maintain the integrity of it and not have any outside pressure, and then let it be what it wants to be and play and experiment and see what it really wants to be. And I recently did a piece, a digital commission with Opera Philadelphia, called The Island We Made, that was in collaboration with the filmmaker Matthew Plasek and the drag queen Sasha Velour. And we did a 10-minute opera film, and that was connected to Chimera in the sense that it's lip sync, and it's also themes of identity, and also connected to my childhood and also my relationship to my mother. But at the same time, it was a really great experience too, an opportunity to explore some ideas that I've had, but through the medium of film. And that revealed a lot of things that might be now part of Chimera, even though this is a separate piece. So yeah, it is exciting. I'm just, I'm really grateful for the queens that I get to meet through this, and how this is also not like, someone asked me like, what is this opera about? I don't have an elevator pitch of like, this is about da 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 da. I'm meeting with drag queens that I admire and that I think something in their story and my personal story resonates, and then through getting to know them, write a song specifically for them. And then the narrative of the opera, if there is some kind of narrative, will evolve from that organically. So it is not a usual way of writing something or an opera, and but it feels right, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, that's really
Yeah, so there's no timeline for it.
I know. I want to see it right now.
I would love to see it. I would.
Is this happening now?
I would go somewhere far away to see this. It's so exciting.
Yeah.
So
well, I'm definitely hoping that by 2025 it is done, because it does. You know how it happens also sometimes with passion projects, like, and again, I'm really grateful. I have a lot of commissions lined up, but at the same time, I'm like, but I really want to work on this thing, and I have to be intentional about making space for that, even though it's not an official commission, and because it's something I'm really passionate about. So I have a residency next year in Italy, a 6 weeks residency in Civitella, and I'm hoping to focus on finishing that opera then, and then. Yeah, so hopefully in my own internal, not putting so much pressure on myself, but I want to get this done timeline, there is a 2025 goal in mind.
2025, we'll check back in.
Very, very
good. Yeah, so it's so interesting. These types of projects and the kind of work that you do, I feel are very indicative of what the future of orchestral or you know, art music, or whatever title we want to put on it, music is. Maybe can you give us a couple of thoughts or some projects that you have worked on or are working on that you feel are indicative of what you think this art form can become, at least for you?
Yeah, well, I'll say that just connecting to what I was saying before, the Opera of Philadelphia project was really amazing because it was digital commissions, and just the fact that they would trust me with with an opera, and which, you know, we don't see the singer on the film, even when we hear her through the lips of this drag queen, and just rethinking of opera as like an opera could be a 10-minute film too, like we can bring that kind of this quality of scale to this and the intimacy of this medium. I think they're doing really incredible work with that. And you know, I know this was also tied to the pandemic, so everyone is rethinking um how, you know, to survive and artistically too in these times. But I think they are a really great example of a model of not just putting a band-aid on something and or trying to like, okay, we just have to keep going, but like then this is an opportunity also to like to a medium that, you know, definitely needs new people in. Then how can we also make sure that we're opening it up to others, not only in audience but also in the people that are sharing those stories. Other projects that I can think of are Kronos Quartet has this amazing project called 50 for the Future, and it's 50 commissions, 25 men, 25 women, writing, all living composers writing pieces that are up on their website for download for free. The scores, the parts, recordings, interviews with the composers, interviews with the folks from Kronos, talking about how they put it together. So it's a really incredible resource that is also dismantling this access barriers of who gets access to music by living composers. Yeah. And also a great education resource because talking about this thing of that we're talking about before of new music and people feeling, some audiences or even some performers or just people in general feeling a little hesitant about it, then this is like, there's no excuse. There's so much there and it's all for free. And it's also a really well-made website that you can search for things in a way that is like it's like if you're a string teacher in Ohio and want a piece that has extended techniques for your students, but it's also accessible to their level, you can very specifically search those things and on their website. So I think projects like that are just so inspiring to me to see, and I hope to see more of those.
Yeah. Wow. So, Angélica, before we let you go, we're going to ask you the question we ask all of our guests at the end of each episode. How do we orchestrate change?
I think we orchestrate change by being who we are, but also making sure we're listening and we're making space for others. Advocating for others when you're in a position of power, privilege, making sure you shake things up, you question things, you invite others in, not staying quiet, and just continue to challenge things so that we can actually see change.
Yeah. Well, Angélica, thank you so much for being here. It was absolutely wonderful to talk with you. And I feel like we could talk about a lot of topics for way longer. Oh my goodness.
Sure.
Oh yeah.
Same here.
There's so much to this topic, but I'm really glad you were able to just share a little bit with us about how you feel about identity and composing and all of this stuff. So I'm really just grateful that you were here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I had a great time.
Thanks.
Angélica Negrón, Puerto Rican born and New York City based composer.
Orchestrating Change is a production of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
Our theme music was composed by Eric Gould and performed by Derek Snyder and Tim Adams.
Our audio engineer and mixer is Nathan Maslick, with video and audio editing by Shoreline Media.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time.